In September 1993, a British tabloid newspaper called The Sun published a story with the headline, Michael Jackson's Secret Visits to Hyperbaric Oxygen Chamber. The article claimed that Jackson slept in a special chamber to slow the aging process, and it included a photograph of him lying in what appeared to be a medical device. The image was bizarre, almost science fiction. It showed Jackson in a glass chamber, his eyes closed, looking like a character from a futuristic film. The story spread rapidly. Other tabloids picked it up. Television news programs discussed it. Late-night comedians made jokes about it. Within days, millions of people around the world believed that Michael Jackson slept in an oxygen chamber. The only problem was that it was not true. The photograph had been staged by Jackson's own publicist as a publicity stunt, and the tabloids had taken it and run with it, transforming a single-staged photo op into a narrative about Jackson's eccentricity and detachment from reality. This incident was not an isolated case. It was part of a pattern that would define Jackson's relationship with the media for the rest of his life, a pattern of sensationalism, distortion, and the gradual construction of an image that bore little resemblance to the truth. The relationship between Michael Jackson and the media began in a very different place. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Jackson was the subject of almost universally positive coverage. He was a child star who had successfully transitioned to adult superstardom. The release of Off the Wall in 1979 and Thriller in 1982 made him the most popular entertainer in the world. Magazine covers featured his face. Interviews portrayed him as talented, hardworking, and humble. The media narrative was one of triumph, a young black man from a working-class background who had achieved unprecedented success through talent and determination. But as Jackson's fame grew, so did the media's appetite for stories about him. And as the tabloid industry expanded in the 1980s, the nature of that coverage began to change. Tabloid journalism operates on a different set of principles than traditional journalism. Where mainstream newspapers and magazines aim for accuracy, balance, and verification, tabloids prioritize sensationalism, shock value, and sales. The more outrageous the story, the better. Truth is secondary to entertainment. In the United States and the United Kingdom, tabloids like the National Enquirer, The Sun, and the Daily Mirror built their businesses on celebrity gossip, often paying sources for stories and publishing claims without rigorous fact-checking. In the 1980s, Michael Jackson became one of their favorite targets. His fame, his wealth, and his unconventional lifestyle made him a perfect subject for sensational stories. The oxygen chamber story was a turning point. It demonstrated that the tabloids could take a kernel of truth, in this case a staged photograph, and transform it into a narrative that millions of people would believe. Jackson's publicist had arranged the photo as a tongue-in-cheek publicity stunt, a way to generate buzz and keep Jackson in the headlines. But the tabloids presented it as fact, as evidence of Jackson's bizarre behavior. And once the story was out there, it took on a life of its own. Jackson later said in interviews that he was frustrated by the story, that it had been blown out of proportion, but the damage was done. The image of Jackson as an eccentric who did strange things to his body had been planted in the public consciousness. The hyperbaric chamber story was followed by others, each more outlandish than the last. Tabloids claimed that Jackson wanted to buy the remains of the Elephant Man, that he had proposed to Elizabeth Taylor, that he wore a surgical mask in public to avoid germs. Some of these stories had a basis in fact. Jackson did own a bid on the Elephant Man's skeleton, though he never intended to purchase it, and the bid was part of a charity auction. He was close friends with Elizabeth Taylor, though there was no romantic relationship. He did sometimes wear masks in public, though this was often due to concerns about illness or to maintain privacy. But the tabloids stripped away context, exaggerated details, and presented these stories in ways that made Jackson seem increasingly detached from reality. One of the most damaging narratives constructed by the media concerned Jackson's changing appearance, particularly his skin color. In the early 1980s, Jackson had brown skin. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, his skin had become noticeably lighter. The tabloids and mainstream media speculated endlessly about why this was happening. The most common explanation offered was that Jackson was deliberately bleaching his skin because he wanted to be white. This narrative fit into broader cultural anxieties about race, identity, and self-hatred. It suggested that Jackson was ashamed of being black, that he was trying to erase his racial identity. The story was repeated so often that it became accepted as fact by much of the public. But the truth was medical, not psychological. Jackson suffered from vitiligo, a chronic skin condition that causes patches of skin to lose pigmentation. Vitiligo is not rare. It affects approximately 1% of the global population. It occurs when melanocytes, the cells that produce skin pigment, are destroyed by the immune system. The result is irregular patches of lighter skin that can spread over time. For someone with dark skin, the contrast between affected and unaffected areas is particularly noticeable. The condition can be emotionally distressing, as it changes a person's appearance in ways they cannot control. Jackson first mentioned his vitiligo publicly in a 1993 interview with Oprah Winfrey, one of the most watched television interviews in history. Sitting across from Winfrey at his Neverland Ranch, Jackson addressed the skin color rumors directly. He said that he had vitiligo, that it was a condition he had inherited from his father's side of the family, and that he used makeup to even out his skin tone. He became visibly emotional when discussing the rumors, saying that it was painful to be accused of not wanting to be black. He emphasized his pride in his heritage and his frustration with the media's refusal to believe the medical explanation. Despite this public statement, many people remained skeptical. The tabloids continued to push the skin bleaching narrative. Part of the reason for this skepticism was that vitiligo was not widely understood by the general public. Most people had never heard of the condition, and the idea that skin could change color due to a medical condition seemed implausible. The tabloids exploited this lack of knowledge, presenting Jackson's explanation as defensive or dishonest. They pointed to other changes in his appearance, including his nose, which had been altered through multiple surgeries, and suggested that the skin color change was part of a broader pattern of self-alteration, driven by psychological issues rather than medical necessity. Medical experts who have studied Jackson's case have confirmed the vitiligo diagnosis. Autopsy reports released after Jackson's death in 2009 noted the presence of vitiligo and stated that his skin had been treated with depigmentation creams, which are standard treatment for the condition. When vitiligo affects a large portion of the body, dermatologists often recommend using topical creams to lighten the remaining pigmented areas, creating a more uniform appearance. This is not the same as bleaching skin for cosmetic reasons. It is a medical treatment for a disfiguring condition. But this nuance was lost in the media coverage, which continued to frame Jackson's lighter skin as a choice rather than a consequence of disease and treatment. The media's treatment of Jackson's vitiligo is a case study in how misinformation spreads and persists. Once the skin bleaching narrative was established, it became the dominant explanation, repeated in countless articles, television segments, and conversations. Corrections and clarifications had little impact. Even after Jackson's public disclosure and the medical evidence that emerged after his death, many people continued to believe that he had deliberately bleached his skin. This persistence reflects a broader pattern in media narratives. Sensational stories are easier to spread and harder to correct than accurate but less exciting information. Photograph manipulation was another tool used by tabloids to distort Jackson's image. In the pre-digital era, tabloids would alter photographs using traditional darkroom techniques, adjusting lighting, contrast, and composition to make Jackson appear more unusual or disturbing. In one infamous case, a tabloid published a photograph of Jackson that had been heavily retouched to make his skin appear even lighter and his features more distorted than they were in reality. The image was presented as a candid photo, but it was actually a manipulated version designed to shock readers and sell magazines. As digital photo editing became more accessible in the 1990s, the manipulation became more sophisticated. Tabloids could now alter images with precision, creating photographs that looked authentic but were entirely fabricated. Jackson's legal team repeatedly threatened lawsuits over these manipulated images, and in some cases they succeeded in forcing retractions. But the retractions were always smaller and less prominent than the original false stories, buried on inside pages while the sensational claims had been splashed across front pages. The asymmetry between the spread of misinformation and the reach of corrections meant that the false narratives always had a wider audience. The economic incentives driving tabloid coverage of Jackson were substantial. A magazine with Jackson's face on the cover could expect significantly higher sales than one without. This created a feedback loop. Tabloids published sensational Jackson stories because they sold well, and they sold well because readers had been conditioned to expect outrageous claims about him. Jackson himself was aware of this dynamic and occasionally played into it, understanding that media attention, even negative attention, could be valuable for maintaining relevance. But he also expressed frustration and pain at the way he was portrayed, describing the tabloid coverage as a form of persecution. The mainstream media's relationship with Jackson was more complicated than that of the tabloids, but it was not immune to the same dynamics. Major newspapers and television networks would often report on tabloid claims, framing them as reports suggest or according to sources, which gave the stories a veneer of credibility without requiring the same level of verification. This created a laundering effect, where unverified tabloid claims entered the mainstream discourse and became part of the accepted narrative about Jackson. The line between tabloid and mainstream coverage blurred, particularly when it came to Jackson, whose fame and eccentricity made him irresistible to all forms of media. The 1993 child abuse allegations marked a shift in media coverage. Before 1993, the coverage of Jackson had been sensational, but largely focused on his eccentricities and personal life. After the allegations, the coverage became darker and more serious. Tabloids and mainstream media alike treated the allegations as credible, often presenting them in ways that assumed guilt before any legal process had concluded. Headlines described Jackson as a suspected predator. Photographs were selected and edited to make him appear sinister. The presumption of innocence, a cornerstone of the legal system, was largely absent from the media coverage. The media's handling of the 1993 case set a pattern that would repeat in 2003 when new allegations emerged. In both cases, the media reported extensively on the accusations, giving significant airtime and column inches to the accusers and their claims. But when Jackson was not charged in 1993 and when he was acquitted in 2005, the media coverage of those outcomes was far less prominent. The accusations received front-page treatment. The lack of charges and the acquittal were relegated to smaller stories. This imbalance reinforced the public perception that Jackson was guilty, even in the absence of a conviction. Journalists who covered Jackson during this period have since reflected on their role in shaping his public image. Some have expressed regret, acknowledging that the pressure to generate clicks, views, and sales led them to prioritize sensationalism over accuracy. Others have defended their coverage, arguing that Jackson's behavior was legitimately newsworthy and that the public had a right to know about the allegations against him. But even those who defend the coverage often acknowledge that the media's focus on scandal and controversy overshadowed other aspects of Jackson's life and career, including his musical innovations, his philanthropic work, and the complexities of his personal struggles. The rise of the internet in the late 1990s and early 2000s added a new dimension to the media narrative about Jackson. Online gossip sites and forums allowed anyone to publish claims about Jackson without editorial oversight or fact-checking. Rumors that might once have been confined to tabloid magazines could now spread globally within hours. Photoshopped images, fake quotes, and fabricated stories proliferated online, often indistinguishable from legitimate news. Jackson's team struggled to keep up with the volume of misinformation, issuing denials and corrections that reached only a fraction of the audience that had seen the original false claims. One particularly persistent online rumor involved Jackson's children and their biological parentage. Tabloids and internet commentators speculated that Jackson was not the biological father of his 3 children, pointing to their lighter skin tones and facial features as evidence. These claims were invasive and hurtful, and Jackson addressed them in interviews, asserting that he was the biological father and that the speculation was motivated by racism and sensationalism. But the rumors persisted, fed by the same dynamics that had sustained the skin bleaching narrative. a lack of understanding of genetics and skin tone variation, combined with a willingness to believe the most sensational explanation. The media's portrayal of Jackson's relationships with children also contributed to a narrative of suspicion. Photographs of Jackson holding hands with children, inviting them to Neverland, or speaking about his love for children were presented in ways that suggested inappropriate behavior, even when there was no evidence of wrongdoing. The context of these interactions, Jackson's stated belief that he was providing joy to sick and underprivileged children, was often omitted. Instead, the media focused on the optics, the way the relationships appeared to outside observers, and framed them as evidence of something sinister. The cultural impact of this media narrative was profound. By the time of Jackson's death in 2009, his public image was deeply fractured. To some, he remained the king of pop, a musical genius whose contributions to art and culture were unparalleled. To others, he was a tragic figure, a victim of his own fame and the media's relentless scrutiny. And to still others, he was a suspected criminal, someone whose talent could not excuse the allegations against him. These competing narratives coexisted, often within the same individuals, creating a complex and contradictory legacy. After Jackson's death, there was a brief period of more positive media coverage. Obituaries celebrated his musical achievements, his influence on dance and popular culture, and his humanitarian efforts. The focus shifted away from the scandals and toward his artistry, but this shift was temporary. In 2019, the release of the documentary Leaving Neverland brought the allegations back to the forefront, reigniting debates about Jackson's guilt or innocence, and prompting a new wave of media coverage that once again focused on the darkest aspects of his life. The media's role in constructing the Michael Jackson narrative raises broader questions about the responsibilities of journalism and the impact of sensationalism on public discourse. Journalists have a duty to report accurately and fairly, to verify information before publishing, and to provide context that helps the public understand complex issues. But the economic pressures of the media industry, particularly the competition for audience attention, often incentivize shortcuts and sensationalism. In Jackson's case, the result was a media narrative that was often inaccurate, incomplete, and deeply harmful. Some media critics have argued that the coverage of Jackson was driven by racism, that the focus on his changing appearance and unconventional lifestyle reflected broader societal discomfort with a successful black man who did not conform to expectations. Others have pointed to the intersection of race, fame, and scandal, noting that Jackson's blackness made certain narratives, like the skin bleaching story, more potent and more damaging. The way his vitiligo was framed as self-hatred, rather than as a medical condition, reflects assumptions about race and identity that are deeply embedded in media and popular culture. The legal and ethical issues surrounding tabloid journalism are complex. In many countries, including the United States and the United Kingdom, freedom of the press is protected by law, and the standards for what constitutes defamation are high. This means that tabloids can publish stories that are misleading or sensational without facing legal consequences, as long as they do not make provably false statements of fact about specific individuals. Jackson's legal team did pursue some cases against tabloids, securing settlements and retractions in instances where the publications had clearly crossed the line. But these victories were limited, and they did little to stem the overall flow of sensational coverage. The question of whether Jackson himself contributed to the media narrative is worth considering. There is evidence that he sometimes courted controversy, understanding that outrageous stories kept him in the public eye. The Hyperbaric Chamber photo, for instance, was his publicist's idea, a deliberate attempt to generate buzz. Jackson also gave interviews in which he made statements that were open to interpretation, such as his admission that he shared his bed with children, which he insisted was innocent, but which many found troubling. Some observers have argued that Jackson's willingness to engage with the media on these terms made him complicit in his own sensationalization. Others counter that Jackson was trying to control a narrative that was spiraling beyond his control, and that his attempts to engage with the media were defensive rather than provocative. The impact of the media narrative on Jackson's mental health and well-being is difficult to quantify but clearly significant. Friends and associates described him as being deeply hurt by the tabloid coverage, particularly the stories about his appearance and the allegations of child abuse. He spoke in interviews about feeling betrayed by the media, about the pain of seeing his image distorted and his intentions questioned. The stress of this coverage, combined with the pressures of fame and his existing health issues, contributed to his physical and emotional decline in his later years. The media's treatment of Jackson also had an impact on his career. Major corporations became wary of associating with him after the 1993 allegations, leading to the loss of endorsement deals and business partnerships. Radio stations reduced airplay of his music, particularly after the 2003 allegations and the 2005 trial. While Jackson remained popular in many parts of the world, particularly outside the United States, his commercial viability in his home country was severely diminished. This economic impact was a direct result of the media narrative, which had branded him as controversial and potentially toxic to brands. In the years since Jackson's death, some journalists and media organizations have issued apologies or expressed regret for their coverage. Documentaries and retrospectives have examined the media's role in shaping Jackson's public image, often concluding that the coverage was excessive, unfair, and at times cruel. But these reflections have done little to change the underlying dynamics of celebrity journalism, which continue to prioritize sensationalism and scandal over accuracy and context. The case of Michael Jackson and the media is a reminder of the power of narrative. The stories we tell about public figures shape how they are remembered, how they are judged, and how their legacies are understood. When those stories are based on distortion, exaggeration, and misinformation, the consequences can be devastating, not just for the individual, but for public discourse more broadly. The media's treatment of Jackson's vitiligo, for instance, contributed to widespread misunderstanding of the condition and reinforced harmful stereotypes about race and identity. The coverage of the abuse allegations, regardless of their veracity, created a climate of suspicion that overshadowed Jackson's artistic achievements and complicated efforts to assess his life and legacy fairly. The question of how to remember Michael Jackson remains contentious. Is he primarily an artist whose music and performances changed popular culture? Is he a victim of media sensationalism and false accusations? Is he someone whose behavior, while not criminal, was inappropriate and troubling? Or is he some combination of all of these? The media narrative has made it difficult to answer these questions clearly, because the information available to the public has been filtered through a lens of sensationalism and distortion. Separating truth from fiction, context from caricature, requires effort and critical thinking that many people are unwilling or unable to invest. The lessons of the Michael Jackson media narrative extend beyond one individual. They speak to the need for media literacy, for the ability to critically evaluate sources and recognize sensationalism. They highlight the importance of journalistic ethics and the dangers of prioritizing profit over truth. And they remind us that behind every public figure, no matter how famous or controversial, is a human being whose life and legacy deserve to be represented accurately and fairly. The media failed Michael Jackson in many ways, constructing a narrative that was often more fiction than fact. Understanding how and why that happened is essential, not just for understanding Jackson, but for understanding the media landscape we all navigate.